The sun rose gently over Munich on September 5, 1972. It was a quiet morning, cool air, soft light, the sound of birds echoing through the Olympic village. The games of the XX Olympiad were nearing their end. It had been, until that day, a celebration of joy, color, and reconciliation. The first Olympics held in Germany since the dark shadow of 1936. The world had come to see a new Germany, peaceful, democratic, open. The hosts called it the Happy Games. They wanted to erase the image of the past. No soldiers, no uniforms, no aggression. Just color, laughter, and sport. Athletes from all over the world walked freely through the village. No armed guards. No fences. Security was light by design, almost symbolic. The organizers wanted the world to see that this was not the Germany of war but of peace. No one could have imagined how cruelly that image would shatter. Inside the Olympic Village, life moved in rhythm. Morning jogs, breakfast chatter, the distant cheers from the swimming pool. In Building 31, a group of 11 Israeli athletes slept soundly. They were wrestlers, weightlifters, coaches, men who had come not to fight but to compete. Many of them were survivors or descendants of Holocaust survivors. For them, representing Israel and Germany carried a weight far beyond sport. To stand here, on this soil, under the same flag that once symbolized death, it was more than competition. It was redemption. And that morning, redemption was ambushed by history. In the shadows outside the village, 8 men approached the fence. They wore tracksuits and carried sports bags, blending in with the athletes around them. But inside those bags were AK-47s, grenades, and ammunition. They were members of Black September, a Palestinian militant group seeking to draw global attention to their cause. Their mission was simple, brutal, and precise: to infiltrate the Olympic Village, take Israeli hostages, and demand the release of prisoners held in Israel. It was a plan born of desperation, and executed in cold silence. At 4:30 a.m. they reached the fence. Nearby athletes returning from late-night parties saw them and thought nothing of it, assuming they were fellow competitors sneaking back in after curfew. Some even helped them over the fence, laughing, unaware that they were lifting terrorists into the heart of the Olympic Games. Moments later, the men disappeared into the quiet pathways of the village, moving swiftly toward the Israeli quarters. Inside apartment 1 at Kanalstrasse 31, the Israeli team slept. Moshe Weinberg, the wrestling coach, stirred awake at the sound of footsteps. He opened the door, and saw the barrel of a gun. The first moments were chaos. Weinberg tried to fight. He was shot through the cheek. Yosef Romano, a weightlifter, lunged forward to disarm one of the attackers. He was shot dead. The rest were taken hostage. Bound, beaten, terrified. Within minutes, the Israeli team's apartment had become a war zone, and the Olympic Village a battlefield. The attackers shouted in Arabic, demanding names and rooms. They moved methodically through the building, rounding up the Israelis, 11 in total. Outside, the morning air was still calm. Birds sang. Cameras flashed elsewhere in the city as journalists prepared to cover another day of competition. No one yet knew that the Olympics had just turned into a nightmare. By 5 a.m., the attackers hung a note on the door. "We are Black September." They demanded the release of 234 Palestinian prisoners from Israeli jails, and 2 German radicals imprisoned in Frankfurt. They gave the authorities until 9 a.m. to comply. Inside, the hostages huddled together, bleeding, praying, waiting. They were surrounded by the echoes of the past, the irony unbearable. Jews held hostage by armed men in Germany. In the same land where millions had once been slaughtered, they were again fighting for their lives. By dawn, police surrounded the building. News began to spread, first through whispers, then through headlines, then across the world. The Happy Games had become a tragedy in real time. Television crews gathered outside the gates. Reporters whispered into microphones, their voices shaking. The world watched, stunned. For the first time, an act of terrorism was unfolding live, broadcast to millions. And through it all, the Olympic Village remained eerily still. No alarms. No chaos. Just an unnatural calm, as if the games themselves refused to admit what was happening. The German authorities were unprepared. They had no counterterrorism unit. No protocol. No experience. They were hosting the games of peace, and now they were facing war. Negotiators tried to reach the terrorists through windows, shouting in broken Arabic. Journalists climbed fences for better angles. Crowds gathered outside as if it were theater. But inside that small apartment the clock was ticking. 11 lives hung in the balance. As morning turned to afternoon, the demands intensified. Black September wanted transportation to Cairo, safe passage out of Germany. Israel refused to negotiate. "We do not deal with terrorists," said Prime Minister Golda Meir. The German government begged for time, hoping to find a solution that didn't exist. Meanwhile, television cameras captured everything. The police moving around, the athletes watching from balconies, the terrorists standing at the windows with masks and rifles. The image of one masked man standing on the balcony of apartment 31 became the face of Munich 1972. It was the face of innocence lost. The morning of September 5th stretched endlessly. What began as a whisper of unease in the Olympic Village had turned into a nightmare broadcast across the world. Outside Building 31, hundreds of journalists, photographers, and onlookers had gathered behind police lines. The air was filled with the hum of cameras and the murmurs of disbelief. In the windows above them, the black silhouettes of masked men moved in and out of view. And behind one curtain, a rifle glinted in the light. Inside, time had lost meaning. The air was thick with fear and sweat. The Israeli athletes sat huddled together, guarded by their captors. Some prayed. Some whispered to each other in Hebrew, trying to stay calm. They had been beaten, threatened, and tied to furniture. Two of their teammates, Moshe Weinberg and Yosef Romano, were already dead. Romano's body lay in the room beside them. He had fought for their lives and lost his own. The surviving athletes tried not to look at him. But his presence reminded them what resistance would cost. The terrorists were young, most of them in their early 20s. They spoke little German, little English. They called each other by code names: Issa, Tony, Badr, Khalid. They were nervous but disciplined. Their leader, Latif Afif, known as Issa, had studied in Germany years earlier. He knew the streets, the culture, the cameras. He also knew that the world's eyes were on them, and that was exactly what he wanted. This wasn't just an attack. It was a message. To Israel, to Germany, to the entire world. By 9 a.m., the deadline for their first demand had passed. No prisoners had been released. No planes had arrived. Negotiators tried to stall. German police, dressed in bright blue uniforms, gathered outside the building, visible from every window. They tried to look calm, but they were improvising every step. There were no special forces. No snipers. No tactical units. This was supposed to be the games of peace. And now, the peaceful were pretending to be soldiers. The terrorists shouted through the door, "Do not play with us. We are ready to die." A translator relayed their words to the German negotiators, who stood trembling behind a wall. They could hear the crying inside. They could smell the fear through the broken plaster. The Germans tried to offer food and cigarettes. They hoped to buy time. One negotiator, a small, soft-spoken police officer named Manfred Schreiber, approached the window and asked to speak to the leader. Issa appeared, calm but tense, his face half covered by a black ski mask. "Don't make us kill them," he said quietly. "We don't want to kill. But we will if we must." Then he pulled the curtain closed. Hours passed. Outside, the crowds grew larger. TV crews climbed onto cars, onto trees, onto rooftops. They filmed everything, every move, every whisper, every shadow. No one realized that the terrorists inside were watching those same broadcasts on a small television in the apartment. They could see every police position, every plan. It was chaos disguised as negotiation. Inside the apartment, the hostages began to talk among themselves. Some begged their captors for mercy. Others asked for water. They were told to stay quiet, to sit still, to wait. And in that waiting, something unimaginable happened. A strange, fragile thread of humanity began to form. Issa, the leader, allowed one hostage, André Spitzer, a fencing coach who spoke fluent German, to act as a go-between. Spitzer tried to reason with him, to remind him that this was the Olympics, not a battlefield. Issa listened. He was educated, articulate, polite even. He said he admired Spitzer, that he respected the athletes. But he said something else too, something cold, something final. He said, "We have waited 24 years for the world to hear us. Today they will." By noon, Chancellor Willy Brandt and the entire German cabinet were in crisis meetings. The situation was spiraling. They contacted Golda Meir in Israel, pleading for flexibility, any gesture that could save lives. Her response was resolute. "If we give in today, every Israeli everywhere becomes a target tomorrow." It was a decision made of steel and sorrow. The games continued unbelievably. While 11 men sat hostage in one corner of Munich, records were being broken in the stadium just a mile away. Athletes ran, swam, jumped. The Olympic flame burned. 4 hours, the International Olympic Committee debated whether to suspend the games. But the organizers, desperate to maintain the illusion of peace, decided to keep going. They told the world, the spirit of the games must not be defeated. It was a tragic irony, the games of peace continuing while men begged for life just beyond the camera's edge. As afternoon turned to evening, the standoff reached its breaking point. Issa demanded transportation, a bus to take the hostages and terrorists to the airport. From there they would board a plane to Cairo. Germany agreed. They had no other choice. They planned a rescue. But it was a plan born of fear and inexperience, a plan that would fail catastrophically. Shortly after 10 p.m., 2 helicopters landed near the Olympic Village. The hostages, blindfolded and bound, were marched outside at gunpoint. They stumbled through the night air, surrounded by flashbulbs and floodlights. Spectators climbed trees to watch. Cameras rolled. The world held its breath. The buses took them to a nearby air base, Fürstenfeldbruck. German police dressed as pilots waited inside a plane, hoping to ambush the terrorists once they boarded. But Issa was cautious. He demanded to inspect the plane first. When he saw that the crew was missing, he knew it was a trap. He shouted in Arabic, "It's over." The gunfire began. At 11:30 p.m., the night sky over Munich erupted in chaos. Shots echoed through the airbase. Tracer bullets lit up the darkness. Helicopters spun under gunfire. Reporters hiding in the grass captured fragments of the horror through their cameras. No one knew what was happening. Not the negotiators. Not the journalists. Not the world watching live on television. The firefight lasted for more than an hour. When it was over, the air was thick with smoke and silence. Bodies lay scattered across the tarmac. The hostages, still bound and gagged, were found in the wreckage of the helicopters. All 11 were dead. Some shot. Some burned alive. The games of peace had ended in blood and fire. The gunfire had stopped. The airfield at Fürstenfeldbruck was a scene from hell. Torn bodies, shattered glass, the smell of gasoline and death thick in the air. The helicopters that had carried the hostages sat twisted and burning, their blades bent like broken wings. For hours after midnight, the scene was illuminated only by the pulsing lights of police cars and ambulances. The games of peace had ended in fire. But in those first few hours no one knew the truth. At 3 a.m., a German government spokesperson stepped before the cameras and smiled. He announced, "All the hostages are safe." It was a lie, born of confusion, denial, or perhaps the desperate hope that speaking safety aloud could make it real. The news spread like wildfire across the world. The Israelis are alive. The rescue succeeded. In Tel Aviv, families wept with relief. In the Olympic Village, athletes cheered. In New York, newspaper presses rolled with headlines of triumph. And then, 3 hours later, the truth arrived, brutal, undeniable, and final. At dawn, the correction came. All hostages have been killed. The lie died with the sunrise. And the world woke up to horror. 11 athletes, 11 lives, extinguished in a single night. In the Olympic Village, the Israeli flag was lowered to half-mast. An eerie silence hung over the stadiums, once filled with cheers. The sound of applause was replaced by sobbing. Every nation's delegation gathered together in the heart of the village. Some stood in prayer. Some in disbelief. some in shame. The same rings that symbolized unity now hung over a city drowning in grief. In the Israeli dormitory, investigators moved quietly through the wreckage. Blood on the floor. Bullet holes in the walls. Shoes scattered across the hallway. A suitcase still packed. A photograph of a family untouched by the chaos. It looked less like a crime scene and more like a massacre, a tragedy scripted by human failure. The international reaction came fast and divided. Some demanded justice. Others demanded silence. The organizers of the Olympics faced an impossible question. Should the Games continue? A meeting was called in the early morning hours of September 6. The International Olympic Committee gathered in a small, dimly lit room, as the world waited for an answer. Avery Brundage, the IOC president, pale and trembling, said only, "The Games must go on." And with those 4 words, history turned cold. The following day, a memorial service was held in the Olympic Stadium. The sky was gray. 80,000 people filled the stands in total silence. The Olympic flame burned faintly against the wind. At the center of the field stood 11 empty chairs. On each, a flower, a name, a nation that would never forget. The ceremony began with a simple message. Today we mourn, but tomorrow we continue. And while the orchestra played, some bowed their heads. Others stood frozen in disbelief. The idea of continuing the Games felt impossible, indecent even. But the decision had already been made. The Olympics would resume within 24 hours. To many Israelis, that decision felt like betrayal. The blood of their athletes had not yet dried, and the world was already moving on. In Tel Aviv, Prime Minister Golda Meir issued a statement filled with controlled fury. The world must know that Israel will not forget and will not forgive. And she meant it. Within weeks, Israel launched Operation Wrath of God, a covert campaign to track down and eliminate every individual involved in the Munich attack. It would span decades, cross continents, and blur every line between justice and revenge. But that was still to come. In Munich, the immediate aftermath was chaos. Logistical, emotional, moral. The German authorities faced public outrage. Their handling of the crisis had been disastrous from start to finish. Poor planning. Poor training. Poor communication. There had been no command center. Snipers had been amateurs. Negotiators had been improvising. The entire operation had been broadcast live, watched by the very terrorists they were trying to outmaneuver. It was not just tragedy, it was incompetence elevated to catastrophe. When the coffins of the 11 Israelis were flown back to Tel Aviv, the world finally saw the cost of that failure. Television cameras captured the rows of caskets, draped in blue and white flags. Mothers collapsed at the sight. Fathers stood in silence, their faces carved from grief. The sound of planes overhead, the same sound that once symbolized arrival and hope, now echoed as mourning. Thousands lined the streets of Tel Aviv as the coffins passed. 11 names whispered through the crowd. 11 faces on posters. 11 souls that the world had promised to protect and didn't. In Munich, the flags at the Olympic Village returned to full height the next day. The decision shocked many. The symbolism was clear. The Games would continue. And so they did. Records were broken. Medals were awarded. History pretended to move forward. But for many, the Games were already dead. Athletes competed through tears. The joy was gone. The illusion of peace was gone. The Games of 1972 would forever be remembered not for triumph, but for terror. And yet, even in tragedy, the image endured. The flame still burned, fragile but alive. Because that's what humanity does. It keeps moving. Even when it shouldn't. But beneath that fragile continuity, something fundamental had changed. The Olympics would never again be innocent. Munich had ended the age of idealism. From that day forward, every Games would exist behind walls, under guards, in the shadow of fear. The world had entered a new era. One where terrorism could reach anywhere, even the places built for peace. And in the heart of that realization lay the cruelest truth of all. The very event meant to unite humanity had shown how fragile that unity truly was. The Olympic flame burned on. But no one who had seen the smoke rising from Fürstenfeldbruck could ever look at it the same way again. The games continued. Medals were handed out, world records were celebrated, and the television announcers tried to sound cheerful again. But the cheering rang hollow. It echoed through a city that had become a grave. Every laugh, every roar from the stadium, felt like an insult to what had happened only days before. In Israel, they called it the Massacre at Munich. In Germany, they called it the tragedy. And in the halls of the International Olympic Committee, they called it nothing at all. They avoided the word terrorism. They avoided blame. They avoided memory. Because memory was dangerous, it demanded accountability. The German government promised an investigation. They promised reforms. They promised never again. But behind closed doors, they were drowning in guilt and fear. The truth was unbearable. They had failed completely, in planning, in response, in humanity. The same nation that had once built camps of death had now failed to protect Jewish lives on its own soil again. The symbolism was too painful to confront. So they buried it, under silence, under bureaucracy, under the illusion of progress. 4 months after the games, the families of the victims waited for answers. They wanted the truth, about what happened, why it happened, and how it was allowed to happen. But the reports were sealed. The evidence was hidden. The official story became one of unfortunate inevitability. It was easier to call it fate than to admit it was failure. When the families asked for compensation, Germany stalled. When they asked for the truth, they were told it was classified. When they asked for remembrance, they were told not to reopen old wounds. And so, the mothers of Munich became archivists of grief, collecting newspaper clippings, police notes, fragments of truth that the world refused to hold. One mother, Ankie Spitzer, widow of fencing coach André Spitzer, would later say, "Germany wanted to forget. But we couldn't. We lived with the pictures in our heads. We lived with the silence. The silence spread." The International Olympic Committee moved on. New games were planned. New host cities chosen. The speeches spoke again of peace, friendship, unity. Munich faded into the background, treated like a stain that could be polished away with ceremony and slogans. But memory has a way of surviving denial, especially when it's fed by injustice. Because only weeks after the massacre, something happened that deepened the wound. 3 of the surviving terrorists, captured alive after the firefight, were imprisoned in Germany. But they didn't stay there long. On October 29, 1972, a Lufthansa plane was hijacked by members of Black September. They demanded the release of the Munich attackers. Germany complied almost immediately. The terrorists who had murdered 11 Israelis were flown to Libya, greeted as heroes. For the families, it was betrayal beyond words. In Tel Aviv, Golda Meir watched the news in disbelief. Israel's ambassador in Bonn called it a second Munich. It was later revealed that the hijacking may have been staged, that German officials had quietly arranged it as a way to get rid of their problematic prisoners and avoid future attacks. To protect themselves, they released murderers. It was the kind of moral calculation that leaves a scar on history. In Israel, silence turned to rage. The government authorized Operation Wrath of God, one of the most secretive and controversial missions in modern history. Its goal: track down and eliminate every person involved in the Munich massacre, every planner, every financier, every accomplice. The operation lasted more than 20 years. It crossed borders, continents, and laws. Agents of Mossad moved through Europe under false identities, businessmen, tourists, journalists. They waited, watched, and struck with surgical precision. In Rome, in Paris, in Athens, in Beirut. One by one, the men connected to Munich disappeared. Some were shot in hotel lobbies. Some blown up in cars. Others simply vanished. For Israel, it was justice. For others, vengeance. For history, something in between. The operation was a mirror, reflecting the world's moral confusion after Munich. No one was innocent anymore. Every act of violence justified another. Every death echoed the first. Meanwhile, the world tried to move on. But Munich had changed everything. Airports became fortresses. Governments created counter-terrorism units. Germany formed GSG-9, a special police task force trained to deal with hostage crises. Olympic security budgets multiplied tenfold. Barbed wire returned to stadiums. The age of innocence was gone. The age of fear had begun. In the decades that followed, the victims' families continued their fight for recognition. They wanted the games to honor the 11 men publicly, to remember them at every opening ceremony, not as martyrs but as human beings. For years the IOC refused. They said politics had no place in the Olympics. They said remembrance would distract from unity. It was a cruel irony, unity built on silence. Every 4 years the torch was lit again, the speeches repeated the same words about peace, and the world applauded. But for the families each flame felt like betrayal. They would sit at home watching the opening ceremonies, waiting for one word, Munich, and hearing nothing. They wrote letters. They begged presidents. They marched. And still silence. It took 44 years for the Olympic movement to finally say the names. In 2016, during the Rio Games, a memorial was built in Munich and an official moment of silence was observed for the victims. Ankie Spitzer stood there, gray-haired now, her voice trembling. She said, "I waited my whole life for this moment. My husband and his teammates can finally rest." She paused and then added softly, "It should not have taken 44 years. The tragedy of Munich was never just about the deaths. It was about the world's reaction, the denial, the delay, the convenience of forgetting. Because forgetting is easier than remembering. It's cleaner, simpler, less human. But memory costs something. It forces us to face the truth about who we are when peace demands courage. The price of forgetting is always the same. When we forget, we repeat. When we deny, we decay. And when we silence tragedy, we silence the very meaning of humanity. Munich wasn't just a failure of security. It was a failure of empathy, a moment when the world chose comfort over conscience. And that's why, decades later, the image of those 11 men still matters. Because they remind us that the cost of indifference is always paid in blood. 50 years later, the world still remembers the sound of gunfire in the Munich night. Not because it echoes loudly, but because it never truly faded. Time has a way of covering things with dust, blurring the edges, softening the pain. But some moments resist erasure. Some moments stay sharp like glass under the skin. Munich was one of those moments. When the Games of 1972 ended, the athletes went home. The medals were packed away. The stadiums emptied. But for those who had been there, the journalists, the spectators, the officials, something lingered in the air long after the applause had died. The world had witnessed something new, terrorist theater. A crime staged not in darkness but in daylight. For cameras, for headlines, for history. It was the birth of a new kind of war, one fought not on battlefields but in the mind. And the Olympic Games, the stage built for peace, had become the stage for fear. In the years that followed, every host city would carry the weight of Munich, Montreal, Moscow, Los Angeles, Seoul. Every stadium designed with cameras, guards, fences. Every athlete marching under watchtowers. The Olympics, once born from ideals of freedom and brotherhood, became surrounded by walls of steel and suspicion. That was Munich's legacy, the day the dream was forced to wear armor. But the shadow of Munich didn't stop at security gates. It reached into politics, culture, and the human psyche. Governments learned how to weaponize fear. Media learned how to sell it. And citizens learned how to live with it, the uneasy awareness that no place, no moment was truly safe anymore. It was the end of innocence, not just for sport but for the modern world. For Germany the wound cut deep. The country that had promised to show the world a new face, democratic, peaceful, reformed, had once again been forced to confront its ghosts. The phrase "never again" had been carved into its soul after the Holocaust. But Munich made it whisper, "Again here?" The shame was unbearable. The silence that followed, deafening. It took decades before Germany would openly acknowledge how completely it had failed, how its fear of militarism had made it blind to danger. In trying to prove it was no longer a country of soldiers, it had created a world of victims. For Israel, Munich became a scar that never healed. It was a moment of helplessness on foreign soil, the realization that even under Olympic rings, Jews could still die simply for being Jewish. The phrase, "never forget," became not just a memorial but a mission. Every child in Israel learned the names. David Berger, Yosef Romano, Zeev Friedman, Eliezer Halfin, Kehat Shor, Mark Slavin, Amitzer Shapira, Yakov Springer, Andrei Spitzer, Moshe Weinberg, and Yosef Gutfreund. 11 names. 11 lives. Each one carried like a prayer. In 2012, at the London Games, the widows of Munich were once again denied an official moment of silence. They sat in the stands, silent themselves, holding photographs. The world applauded athletes while the ghosts of their husbands floated unseen in the same air. But in 2016 in Rio the moment finally came. A small memorial inside the Olympic Park. A quiet voice on the loudspeaker. Today we remember the 11 Israeli athletes and coaches murdered at the Munich Games. No music. No speeches. Just silence. For the first time the world stood still, as it should have done in 1972. That silence carried across generations. It was the sound of recognition, of delayed justice, of humanity rediscovered. Ankie Spitzer and Ilana Romano, the widows who had fought for decades to make the world remember, stood hand in hand, tears streaming down their faces. Behind them the Olympic flame flickered. Not in triumph but in memory. And in that light, the shadow of Munich seemed for a moment to soften. But even now Munich is not just history. It's a warning. Because the forces that created that tragedy, fanaticism, hatred, denial, still exist. They change names. They change flags. They change slogans. But they remain the same hunger for power, the same willingness to destroy innocence to make a point. Munich teaches us that ideals are fragile. That peace, without vigilance, is just a pause between tragedies. And that unity, the kind the Olympics claim to celebrate, cannot be built on silence. Every year, visitors walk through the Munich Memorial, a quiet garden near the old Olympic Village. The sound of footsteps on gravel. The hum of wind through trees. On the wall, 11 names etched in stone. There are no guards. No speeches. Just stillness. People stand there, some for minutes, some for hours. They read the names, touch the stone, and whisper, "I remember." It's not enough, but it's something. Munich 1972 was not just a tragedy, it was a turning point. It marked the day when the Olympics lost their innocence, and the world lost its illusion of safety. But it also revealed something enduring, the human will to remember, to seek justice, to keep meaning alive even after meaning has been burned away. The games went on. The world moved on. But Munich never left. It lingers in the silence before every opening ceremony. It stands behind every flame lit in the name of peace. It watches every athlete who raises their flag, every crowd that sings its anthem. Because behind all that beauty, all that hope, there's still the echo of that night. A reminder that peace is never given, only protected. 50 years later the flame still burns. But it flickers with awareness. Every spark, every ceremony, every word about unity now carries the shadow of Munich within it. And maybe that's how it should be. Because remembrance is not a burden. It's the only form of justice that time can't steal. The Olympics are supposed to show the best of humanity. But Munich showed the truth, that even the best of us can be broken, and that it takes courage to keep lighting the flame anyway. That courage is what we carry forward. That courage is what endures. The world called them the Games of Peace. But in the end, Munich became something else. A mirror showing us what happens when peace is left unguarded. 11 men came to compete. 11 men never came home. And for 50 years, their silence has spoken louder than every speech, every anthem, every promise of unity that came after. Because their story isn't just about death. It's about remembrance, and the cost of pretending that innocence lasts forever. The flame still burns, yes. But it burns differently now, brighter, heavier, aware. Maybe that's what Munich gave us. The understanding that peace isn't the absence of conflict. It's the courage to face it, to name it, and to keep believing anyway. So as the world gathers again, every 4 years beneath the same rings under the same sky, remember them. Not as victims, but as the moment we learned how fragile the human dream really is. If this story moved you, if you believe these memories should never fade, don't let them. Subscribe. Because every day we bring back another untold chapter of Olympic history, The glory, the darkness, the humanity that time tried to bury. 2 stories every single day. The truth behind the gold, and the ghosts who still walk beside it. Until tomorrow. When another flame begins to burn.